My name is William Billy Carson. I was a corporal in the 101st Airborne Division during the Vietnam War. In 1969, when I was just 20 years old, I shipped off to Vietnam. Like most kids back then, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I'd grown up in a small town in Indiana, working odd jobs and dreaming about things like cars and baseball, not jungles and firefights. I ended up stationed near a place called Firebase Ripcord, deep in the A Shao Valley. It was the kind of place you'd see in those grainy news clips from the war. Thick jungle, towering hills, and a constant, heavy fog that clung to everything. At night, you couldn't see 5 feet ahead of you, and during the day, you were either sweating buckets or soaked by sudden downpours. We were there to set up defenses and disrupt the Viet Cong supply lines in the area. It was supposed to be straightforward, but nothing ever was in Vietnam. By the time I arrived, I'd already heard stories from the older guys in the unit about how bad the valley could get. The Viet Cong were masters of the terrain, using it to their advantage at every turn. They had tunnels, traps, and snipers who could pick you off without ever being seen. We had M16s and grenades, but they had patience and a kind of ruthlessness I hadn't encountered before. One of my first real missions was a patrol deep into the jungle. It was supposed to be routine. Scout an area, clear it of any Viet Cong activity, and report back. But in Vietnam, routine could go sideways in an instant. There were 5 of us. Me, Sergeant Hensley, a wiry guy from Georgia who seemed like he'd been born with a rifle in his hands. Private Young, who was just a kid like me, Specialist King, a quiet guy who didn't talk much but knew his way around a map, and a new guy, Ramirez, who joined us only a week ago. We moved out early, the jungle still heavy with morning mist. The path we were taking wasn't much more than a game trail, winding through dense undergrowth. I kept my eyes on the ground ahead, watching for tripwires or signs of movement, while my ears strained for anything out of place. The jungle wasn't quiet. There were always birds, bugs, and the distant rustle of leaves, but you learned to pick out what didn't belong. We'd been walking for hours when King, who was leading the patrol, raised his hand to stop. We froze, weapons at the ready, as he crouched down to examine something on the trail. I moved up beside him and saw what he was looking at. A fresh boot print, the tread unmistakable. It wasn't ours. The tension ratcheted up instantly. Hensley motioned for us to spread out and move forward slowly, keeping low. Every step felt like it could be your last. The jungle was so thick here that the sunlight barely reached the ground, and shadows seemed to move on their own. My heart was pounding as we crept forward, the print fresh in my mind. We didn't know if the Viet Cong were watching us right then, setting up an ambush or waiting for us to make a mistake. We found the first sign of trouble not far from the print, a crude claymore mine, hidden in the brush along the trail. If we hadn't been watching carefully, one of us could have triggered it. King disarmed it with steady hands, his face unreadable, and we pressed on, more cautious than ever. We hadn't gone far when we came across something else, a small, abandoned camp. There were the remains of a fire pit, a few empty AK magazines, and what looked like a map scrawled on a piece of cloth. It was primitive, but it marked something important, a tunnel entrance nearby. The Viet Cong used tunnels all over Vietnam to move supplies and troops without being detected, and finding one was both a curse and a blessing. It meant we could disrupt their operations, but it also meant we were in for a fight. Hensley made the call to check it out. We moved slowly, with King navigating, and eventually came to the spot marked on the map. It was a nondescript patch of ground, the kind you'd walk right past without a second thought. But as we cleared away some of the undergrowth, we found it, a narrow opening, just big enough for a man to squeeze through. I remember staring at that hole, my stomach twisting. We didn't have much choice, though. Ramirez was the smallest of us, so he went in first with a flashlight and a pistol. The rest of us waited above, tense and ready, as he disappeared into the darkness. It felt like forever before he came back up, his face pale. He'd found the tunnel was much bigger than expected, with multiple branches and signs of recent activity. Hensley decided we needed to go in, all of us this time, to see what we were dealing with. I'll never forget the feeling of climbing down into that tunnel. The air was damp and stale, and the walls seemed to close in around me with every step. My M16 felt too big in my hands, awkward and out of place. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dirt and shadows. Every sound, the scrape of boots, the drip of water, was amplified, setting my nerves on edge. We didn't get far before we found the first cache. Weapons, ammunition, and supplies neatly stacked in a side chamber. It was a gold mine, proof that the Viet Cong were using this tunnel for more than just hiding. But it also meant they'd be back, and probably sooner rather than later. As we moved deeper, the tension kept building. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, with no sense of direction. And then, just as we rounded a corner, we heard it, the faint sound of footsteps ahead. Hearing those footsteps ahead of us froze me to my core. In the tight confines of that tunnel, sound carried strangely. I couldn't tell how far away they were or how many people might be up there. The only thing I knew was that we weren't alone anymore. Hensley motioned for us to stay quiet, his face serious, and we moved forward as carefully as we could. Every step felt like we were tempting fate. The tunnel was just wide enough for one man to walk through at a time, forcing us into a single file line. I was behind King, and I remember gripping my M16 so tightly my knuckles ached. The flashlight beams flickered over the walls, catching little details, scratch marks, small wooden supports, and the occasional rat darting out of sight. We rounded another corner and saw something that made my blood run cold. An AK-47 leaning against the wall, like someone had left it there in a hurry. Next to it was a pack with a few scattered supplies, rice, ammo, and some papers. Whoever had been carrying it was close, maybe just ahead of us. Hensley pointed at the pack and motioned for King to check it out. King crouched down, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other, and sifted through it quickly. I kept my eyes on the tunnel ahead, every shadow looking like it could spring to life. King handed the papers to Hensley, who tucked them into his pocket without a word. We didn't have time to stop and figure out what they were, not with the Viet Cong possibly just a few steps away. We pressed on, the tension so thick I could feel it in my chest. The tunnel began to widen slightly, and we came to a small chamber. It was empty except for a wooden table and a few stools. A lantern sat on the table, still warm to the touch. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, and that wasn't a good sign. Suddenly, there was a noise, faint but unmistakable. A cough. It came from further down the tunnel, just beyond the chamber. My heart felt like it stopped. Hensley motioned for us to spread out as best we could in the cramped space, our rifles trained on the darkness ahead. The plan was clear. If they were coming for us, we'd be ready. But they didn't come. Instead, we heard a sharp click, followed by the unmistakable whomp of an explosion behind us. Dirt and debris rained down, and the tunnel shook like it was going to collapse. One of the Viet Cong had set off a trap, maybe a tripwire we hadn't noticed, and now our way out was gone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were trapped. The air filled with dust, making it hard to breathe, and the faint light from our flashlights barely cut through the haze. Hensley swore under his breath, his usual calm shaken. He pointed ahead, signaling for us to keep moving. If we stayed in one place, we were dead. The tunnel felt more oppressive than ever as we pushed forward, every sound amplified by the tight space. My mind raced, trying to figure out what we'd do if we ran into the Viet Cong. They knew these tunnels like the back of their hand, while we were stumbling around blind. We didn't have to wait long to find out. As we rounded another corner, the flashlight beams caught movement, a figure darting back into the shadows. It was so fast I barely had time to process it before gunfire erupted. The tunnel lit up with muzzle flashes, and the sound was deafening, like being caught in a thunderstorm underground. I dropped to the ground instinctively, my ears ringing, and returned fire in the direction of the flashes. It was chaos. In the confined space, every shot seemed to bounce off the walls, and it was impossible to tell how many of them were out there. Dirt and debris filled the air, stinging my eyes and making it hard to see. Hensley shouted something I couldn't make out, and then I saw him lunge forward, throwing a grenade into the darkness ahead. The explosion was deafening, and for a moment, the gunfire stopped. When the dust settled, we moved forward cautiously, stepping over the bodies of two Viet Cong fighters. They were young, maybe even younger than me. It hit me then that this was their home, their fight. We were just the invaders. I didn't have time to dwell on it, though, because the tunnel opened up into another chamber, and this one wasn't empty. 3 more Viet Cong fighters were there, scrambling to grab their weapons as we burst in. It all happened so fast, the flash of gunfire, the shouts, the smell of burned powder. And then it was over. They were down, and we were still standing, but barely. Ramirez had taken a hit to the arm, a clean-through shot that left him pale and shaking. King tore a strip from his shirt and tied it around the wound as a makeshift bandage. But we all knew he needed real help, and soon. The chamber had more supplies, weapons, maps, even a radio, but none of it mattered if we couldn't find a way out. Hensley was already scanning the walls, looking for another exit. That's when we heard it. Voices, coming from the tunnel behind us. The Viet Cong weren't done yet. The voices behind us sent a chill down my spine. They were low and urgent, echoing through the tunnel. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. It was clear. They knew we were here, and they were coming for us. Hensley didn't waste a second. He motioned for us to grab what we could and keep moving. I slung an AK-47 over my shoulder, just in case we ran out of ammo for our M16s, and King stuffed the radio and maps into his pack. Ramirez was pale and sweating, but he nodded when Hensley asked if he could keep going. We didn't have a choice. The next section of the tunnel was tighter, forcing us to hunch over as we moved. My legs were burning, and the weight of my gear felt like it had doubled, but adrenaline kept me going. Every few steps, I'd glance back, expecting to see the flash of a muzzle or the glint of a Viet Cong's eyes in the flashlight beam. Then we came to a fork. The tunnel split into 2 directions, each one looking as uninviting as the other. Hensley hesitated, his flashlight sweeping over the walls and floor, looking for some kind of clue. The voices were getting louder now, closer, and my heart was pounding in my chest. Finally, Hensley picked the left path, and we followed, the air growing even staler as we pressed on. We didn't get far before we hit another chamber. This one was larger than the others, with wooden beams supporting the walls and ceiling. In the center was a table covered in maps and notes, along with a few stools. But what caught my eye was the tunnel opening on the far side. It was wider, with fresh air seeping through. It had a lead outside. Relief washed over me for a split second, but then Hensley held up his hand. Something was wrong. The air in the chamber was too still, too quiet. He motioned for us to spread out and check the room, and that's when I saw it. A tripwire stretched low across the far entrance. I pointed it out, and King crouched down to examine it. His face was grim as he traced the wire to a crude but effective booby trap, a bundle of grenades rigged to collapse the whole chamber if triggered. If we'd taken one wrong step, it would have been the end of us. King disarmed it as quickly as he could, his hand steady despite the sweat dripping down his face. I could hear the voices again, closer now, and my grip tightened on my rifle. They were coming fast, and we were running out of time. Just as King finished, the first shots rang out. The Viet Cong had caught up. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, sending sparks and dirt flying. We dove for cover, returning fire as best we could in the cramped space. I could barely see through the smoke and dust, but I fired toward the flashes of light in the tunnel, hoping to keep them at bay. Ramirez was hit again, this time in the leg. He went down with a cry, clutching his thigh as blood pooled beneath him. King dragged him behind the table while Hensley and I laid down covering fire. My ears were ringing, and the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. It felt like the firefight went on forever, but in reality, it was probably only a few minutes. The Viet Cong weren't giving up, though, and we were running low on ammo. Hensley yelled for us to fall back to the far entrance, and we dragged Ramirez with us, his face pale and his breathing ragged. As we reached the wider tunnel, Hensley threw his last grenade into the chamber behind us. The explosion rocked the ground, sending a cloud of dirt and debris rushing toward us. It wouldn't stop the Viet Cong for long, but it bought us a few precious seconds. The wider tunnel was a godsend. We could move faster now, and the air was fresher, giving me a second wind. But the relief didn't last. The tunnel sloped upward, and just as we thought we might be nearing the surface, we heard another sound, barking. Dogs! The Viet Cong had released dogs to track us. My stomach dropped. I'd heard stories about the dogs they used, vicious and relentless. Once they were on your scent, they wouldn't stop until they found you. Hensley set a brutal pace, practically dragging Ramirez along as we pushed forward. My legs felt like lead, and every breath burned my lungs, but the thought of those dogs kept me moving. We came to a sharp bend in the tunnel, and that's when we saw it, a faint glow of daylight ahead. Freedom was so close I could taste it, but the barking was getting louder, and I knew we weren't out of danger yet. We burst out of the tunnel into the jungle, the sudden brightness blinding after so long underground. The air was thick and humid, but it felt like the sweetest breath I'd ever taken. We didn't stop running. The jungle was alive with sound, and I could hear the dogs behind us, crashing through the undergrowth. Hensley led the way, his instincts keeping us on a zigzagging path to throw them off. Just when I thought we might have lost them, we stumbled into a clearing, and straight into another Viet Cong patrol. Stumbling into that clearing was like running headfirst into a nightmare. The Viet Cong patrol wasn't huge, maybe 6 or 7 guys, but they were armed, alert, and way too close. For a split second, nobody moved. It was like time froze, all of us caught off guard. Then everything erupted at once. The first shots came from the Viet Cong, bullets zipping past us and kicking up dirt. Hensley didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee and fired, his shots hitting 2 of them before they could even react. I hit the ground hard, my M16 clutched tight, and started firing as well. The jungle came alive with the deafening crack of gunfire and the shouts of men. Ramirez was down again, his leg too injured to let him move. King stayed low, dragging him behind a fallen log while returning fire. I saw one of the Viet Cong go down, his AK-47 tumbling from his hands, but the others were spreading out, trying to flank us. They knew this terrain better than we did, and they were using it to their advantage. The barking of the dogs was getting louder, closer. The patrol must have heard it too, because they started moving faster, trying to pin us down before reinforcements arrived. My heart was racing, and my hands were slick with sweat, but I kept firing, switching targets as fast as I could. The jungle offered some cover, but it was thin, and every time I moved, I felt exposed. Then I heard it, a click behind me, sharp and unmistakable. I froze, my stomach dropping. One of the Viet Cong had circled around and was standing just a few feet away, his rifle trained on me. I could see his face clearly, young and tense, his finger hovering over the trigger. Before I could even react, a shot rang out, and the guy crumpled to the ground. I turned to see King, his pistol still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. He didn't say a word, just gave me a quick nod, and turned his attention back to the fight. I'll never forget that moment. He'd saved my life without hesitation. We were holding our own, but barely. Hensley was yelling for us to fall back, his voice hoarse from shouting over the chaos. I grabbed Ramirez's arm, helping King pull him to his feet. The poor guy was pale as a ghost, but he managed to hobble along as we retreated deeper into the jungle. The Viet Cong weren't letting up. They were chasing us hard, and the dogs were right on our heels. The barking was so loud now it felt like they were snapping at my boots. Hensley pulled something from his pack, a smoke grenade, and tossed it behind us. Thick gray smoke billowed out, covering our retreat, but it wouldn't hold them off for long. We ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire. Every step was agony, my legs screaming for me to stop, but I didn't dare slow down. The jungle was a blur, the sounds of gunfire and barking fading in and out as adrenaline took over. I didn't know where we were going, only that we had to keep moving. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take another step, we broke through the trees and into a ravine. It was steep and rocky, with a narrow stream running along the bottom. Hensley made the call to slide down, using the natural cover to put some distance between us and the Viet Cong. It wasn't pretty. We tumbled and scraped our way down, the rocks tearing at our fatigues, but it worked. At the bottom, we regrouped. Ramirez was in bad shape, his leg bleeding heavily despite King's makeshift bandage. Hensley crouched by the stream, his face grim as he scanned the ridge above. I kept my rifle trained on the tree lean, my hands shaking from exhaustion and fear. The barking had stopped. That was almost worse than hearing it, because now we didn't know where they were. The jungle had gone eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every little sound seem like a threat. We stayed low, catching our breath, and trying to figure out our next move. That's when Hensley noticed the tracks. Along the stream, partially hidden by the rocks, were footprints. Not ours. These were older, and they led deeper into the ravine. It was risky, but we didn't have many options. If we stayed where we were, the Viet Cong would catch up eventually. Following the tracks might lead us to safety or into another ambush. We followed them. The ravine was narrow and twisting, the walls pressing in on either side. The stream was shallow but slippery, and every step felt like it could send me sprawling. The tracks led to a small cave, barely visible against the rocky wall. Hensley went in first, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. It wasn't much of a cave, just a shallow depression in the rock, but it was big enough for us to hide. We piled in, keeping as quiet as possible, and waited. The minutes dragged on like hours. My breathing was heavy, and every sound outside made me tense up, expecting the worst. Hensley was at the entrance, his rifle ready, while King worked on Ramirez's leg with what little supplies we had. I sat there, clutching my M16, trying not to think about how close we'd come to dying today. And then we heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving along the ravine above us. The footsteps echoed above us, slow and deliberate, like someone taking their time to search. I held my breath, gripping my M16, so tight my hands ached. The others were just as still, their faces tense and pale in the dim light of the cave. Every muscle in my body was screaming to move, to run, but I knew better. One sound, one misstep, and we were done for. Hensley stayed at the entrance, peering out with his rifle ready. He motioned for us to stay low and silent, his face grim. The footsteps paused, and I felt my heart stop. Whoever it was, they were close, too close. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the trickle of the stream, and the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then, another sound joined the mix, the bark of a dog. It was faint but unmistakable, and it was getting louder. They had found us. Hensley turned and motioned sharply for us to get ready. There was no point in hiding anymore. If they were coming, we'd have to fight. I checked my ammo, barely a few rounds left in my magazine, and readied myself. King handed me one of the AK-47s we'd taken earlier, a grim look on his face. We all knew this was going to be messy. The first shadow appeared at the edge of the ravine, silhouetted against the faint light filtering through the jungle canopy. Then another. The Viet Cong were moving cautiously, their rifles raised, scanning the area. The dog barked again, leading them closer to our hiding spot. I counted 5 of them, but there could have been more. Hensley waited until they were almost on top of us before he opened fire. The first shot dropped the point man instantly, his body crumpling into the stream. The rest of us joined in, the cave lighting up with the flashes of our rifles. The narrow ravine amplified the noise, turning it into a deafening roar. The Viet Cong scrambled for cover, firing back blindly. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around us, sending shards flying. I focused on the nearest target, squeezing the trigger until the magazine ran dry, then switched to the AK. The recoil was different, rougher than the M16, but it did the job. One of the Viet Cong threw a grenade, and I watched in horror as it landed just outside the cave. Hensley yelled for us to get down, and I hit the dirt, covering my head. The explosion was deafening, shaking the ground and filling the air with dirt and debris. My ears were ringing, and for a moment I couldn't tell if I'd been hit. When the dust cleared, I saw Hensley crouched at the entrance, still firing. King was beside me, helping Ramirez reload his rifle despite the blood soaking his uniform. The Viet Cong were regrouping, moving to flank us. We couldn't stay here much longer. Hensley made the call to move. He threw a smoke grenade into the ravine, the thick white cloud spreading quickly and obscuring us from view. We grabbed Ramirez and started climbing up the rocky wall, our hands slipping on the wet stone. My arms were burning, but I didn't stop. The alternative wasn't an option. We reached the top of the ravine and bolted into the jungle. The smoke wouldn't hold them for long, and the dogs were still on our trail. Hensley led the way, moving fast despite the dense undergrowth. The jungle seemed endless, the trees stretching in every direction, but Hensley had a sense for these things. He was leading us somewhere. Finally, we came to a small hill with a flat clearing at the top. There, half buried in the dirt and overgrown with vines, was an old artillery position. It must have been abandoned years ago, just a few rusting barrels and sandbags left behind. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. We set up a defensive position as best we could. Hensley and King took the high ground, their rifles trained on the jungle below. Ramirez was propped up against a tree, his face pale but determined. I found a spot behind a sandbag, the AK-47 resting on the edge as I scanned the tree line. It didn't take long for them to find us. The first dog burst out of the bushes, snarling and snapping, but Hensley dropped it with a single shot. The Viet Cong followed, moving in formation, their rifles blazing. We fired back, the clearing erupting into chaos once again. The fight was brutal. They had numbers and the element of surprise, but we had the high ground and desperation on our side. I lost track of how many rounds I fired, the heat of the rifle barrel scorching my hands. Every time one of them went down, another seemed to take their place. Then, just when it felt like we couldn't hold out any longer, I heard a distant thumping sound, low and rhythmic. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it grew louder, unmistakable. Helicopters. Hensley must have seen them too, because he let out a yell, signaling for us to hold our position. The sound of rotor blades filled the air, and I caught a glimpse of the choppers through the trees. They were American, sleek and powerful, and they were heading right for us. The Viet Cong must have heard them too, because their fire started to falter. Some of them broke off, disappearing into the jungle, but a few stayed, determined to finish the job. We kept firing, refusing to give an inch, until the first chopper hovered overhead, its side door opening to reveal a door gunner. The machine gun roared to life, cutting through the jungle like a scythe. The remaining Viet Cong scattered, disappearing into the trees. I slumped against the sandbag, my body shaking with exhaustion and relief. The fight was over. The choppers landed, and medics rushed out to help us. Ramirez was loaded onto a stretcher, his face pale but alive. I sat in the dirt, my rifle still in my hands, as the reality of what just happened started to sink in. We'd survived. Barely. The ride back to base was a blur. I remember the medics patching us up, the sound of the rotors drowning out everything else. Hensley sat across from me, his face grim but calm. He didn't say a word, but he didn't need to. We'd been through hell, and we'd come out the other side. I still think about that day sometimes. About the tunnel, the ravine, the clearing. About the men who didn't make it. I don't know why we survived when so many didn't, but I'm grateful. And I'll never forget the ones who didn't come home.